Our second speaker, Marina Vishmidt, is not here. She's in Vienna right now and she has recorded a paper for us. There is no video, it's only audio. So you might want to take your notepad and doodling if you think that helps you, follow a paper. This is, I think, always helps my concentration. But I briefly wanted to introduce Marina, who will join us. Hi. Who will join us later for the panel discussion at 1:30. Marina is a writer and an art theorist and a contributor of After All, Kaleidoscope, Parquet, and Texte zur Kunst, and E-Flux as well, among others, actually. Marina received her PhD in 2013 from Queen Mary University, and the title of her thesis is Speculation as a Mode of Production in Art and Capital, and she currently lectures at the Dutch Art Institute in Amsterdam. Now, she's turning the thesis into a book with the same title, and the book is coming out early next year with Brill. Marina has also collaborated with the group projects Full Unemployment Cinema and Cinenova. We heard about this earlier, so a link with this space. And her chapter, The Aesthetic Subject and the Politics of Speculative Labor, is included in the Routledge Companion to Art and Politics, which came out this year. So if we can play her paper, and I'll see you in 24 minutes.
In what follows, I seek to explore how the paradox of self-abolition can help us understand the processes of dissolution and constitution implied by revolutionary feminist transformation of social relations, and what role the concept of a subject can play within them. For the moment, I would like to articulate the different notions of self-abolition, which appear in the work of Monique Wittig, Carla Lonzi, and Maya Gonzalez, which set out a perspective on the abolition of women or the abolition of gender. In all these positions, the paradox of self-abolition applies to a collective subject, or a subject that becomes collective in the process of its abolition, that is, in struggle. First, however, I'd like to spell out the problematic of the subject of self-abolition, as it figures as a radical appropriation of a subjugated structural position that sees that position both as a lever to challenge the existing system of domination and as part of what has to be overcome within that structure, a position which is transversal to the psychic, the subjective, and the historical. I found the problematic of self-abolition to be a productive way of thinking the affirmative and negative moments of any radical emancipatory movement, be it class, gender, race, or other hierarchical and naturalized forms of exploitation and control. The analytic of self-abolition also offers a flexible level of abstraction, which can both contextualize and interrogate the positing of any social antagonism or difference as primary, an argument of fundamentality which occurs in many radical social movements. It also helps to articulate concurrently the personal or the as inseparable from the social, since the self-activity of one group to displace or destroy the social relation which holds it in subjugation, at the same time proposes a concrete emancipation to the whole, where that oppression is reproduced. It, in effect, proposes another universality from below, a fissure or a friction in the operation of universality itself. At the same time, which undertakes abolition as a political project of determinate negation, remains open to question, since the radical gesture of universality implicit in a liberation struggle can also reproduce the bad universalities of homogeneity and ahistorical community that underpins the oppressive social order itself. To account for a self-abolishing subject of struggle, then, means both formulating a subject which cannot be valorized or affirmed beyond the struggle, and an agency which drives the struggle that is somehow not already implicit within the social order to be countered or removed, an agency which may be seen as an activated negativity. Following this, I would be interested to open the discussion to a couple of alternative formulations of self-abolition. These are based in strands of revolutionary feminist theory, i.e., theory that reckons with the gendered implications of this so far abstract subject. For Monique Wittig, self-abolition is decisively class-based. The class of women and the heteropatriarchal gender relation that creates women as object and subjected. It can only happen through the process of struggle, which passes through a transitional point, through the individual, a type of subject that women must pass through, which is to say, strategically affirm as a category of struggle because they have been deprived of subjectivity by the gender relation. For Carla Lonzi, subjectivity is also an achievement for women, but one which is understood as a secession from the patriarchal terms of universality and comes in the wake of a transvaluation of all values in the key of sexual difference. The abolition here is one of identification with male-coded values of equality and progress, and the realization of an entirely new world advanced by an entirely new subject who has been hidden from history. Abolition is here rather a form of affirmation. Woman uses the sexual difference allocated to her by patriarchal social relations to transcend those relations, which have produced her as different, as inferior, as belonging to the sphere of immanence, and devoid of subjectivity and history. Class is certainly not to be analogized to gender, since sexual difference is the primary division in all times and places, and it is clear that all struggles which are not explicitly women's struggles are coded as male, a principle which, perhaps unfortunately, if with some contextual alibis, as Teresa de Lauretis reminds us, can be applied to how race and coloniality function, or are omitted from this analysis. For Maya Gonzalez, gender is akin to value. It is a social form separating people not so much from their humanity as from their mutiny as social beings. Real abstractions such as gender, or better, value and labor, are the blocks placed upon this human capacity of openness, reshaping itself under historical conditions. Marx's concept of species being equivocal and liable to essentializing humanist affirmations though it might be, seems at least relevant here, albeit, as Lonzi and many other feminists of sexual difference would argue, this is a species conceived implicitly according to a male model and in patriarchal times. As she says, Marxism has ignored women, both as oppressed people and as bearers of the future. Its revolutionary theory was developed within the framework of a patriarchal culture. End of quote. Unlike Wittig, Gonzalez seeks a structural explanation for why gender should be abolished, and it is like the one communization theory has for the class relation. Capital no longer needs women as women, just like capital no longer needs workers per se. In other words, capital may still need people to occupy the position and perform the tasks associated with women, just like it needs people to work, but a political identity based on either of these positions is now untenable, as a strategic affirmation of either of those social roles can have no emancipatory or transformative implications in the present, when it is no longer a question of being included in the social contract, but of overturning it. Or it may be clearer to say, to overturn it as part of a large-scale movement of social transformation, not in the way capital and the state are overturning it at present. Thus, it is both an objective and subjective movement, but in every case, though the needs of class-based and gender-based struggles are shown as incompatible with one another, given the trans-historical denegation of women in social reproduction and the history of the workers' movement with regard to the women question, self-abolition is still seen as the structure adequate to model the overcoming of both social forms. This brings us closer to Lonzi's position in Let's Spit on Hegel, also with relation to the social contract, which she sees as having never promised anything to women. Though she would be averse to legitimating Gonzalez would be averse to, quote, legitimating female difference as originary human difference, as de Lauretis puts it, preferring to confine her account to the historical present and recent past of the capital relation and the antagonisms it generates, and, importantly, to see self-abolition in explicit analogy with the class struggle, as the necessary consequence of self-organization as and by women to overcome their situation as women. What is important to underline here is that the paradox of self-abolition is not merely a logical problem, but a material one. It attests to the fact that the horizon of transformation is always form-determined by the real abstractions to be transformed or done away with. Unless the problem of subjectivity, of the politics of subjectivation, is addressed, the paradox remains all too concrete, as we've seen in every historical situation of insurrection, of revolution, or even more minimally of self-organization, which is to say, by power, a vision of emancipation itself shaped by relations of power, if not in ideology, then in the experience of struggle against a powerful antagonist, no less than in the experience of existing social relations themselves. And the question of violence, for example, is often posed at this point, albeit often quite abstractly. The approach to power in the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective in the practice of entrustment is a lucid instantiation, as this practice enunciated and underlined differentials of power between women, but in the service of cementing a greater unity as women, which is an equivocal objective, I would argue, since it again presumes the primacy of sexual difference and draws its political alliances and distances accordingly, risking exclusion and insularity in the process, and perhaps more dangerously, stepping aside from capitalist, white supremacist, and patriarchal social relations into a privileged enclave of relationality. Thus, the politics of gendered experience can mistake, just as Lonzi writes about Hegel, the consequences for the causes, affirming a socially and historically produced difference as the terrain of subjectivity, affiliation, and transcendence, rather than an immanence which must itself be negated, with yet unknown, unexpected mediations and unexpected subjects that also puts the subject named woman into question, at the same time as it tears down the bad universalism of patriarchal culture. This also has to grapple with labor and race, as the parallel in the era of the 70s to the mid-80s can abundantly demonstrate, and as queer, indigenous, and women of color feminism does now. We must equally be wary of counterposing sociological to ontological feminisms here, just as in art history we witnessed for many years the red herring of essentialist versus structuralist or psychoanalytic feminism play out across the historiography. The dynamics of affirmation and negation cannot be separated from the theoretical and strategic questions, which means at least as much attentiveness to larger contexts of political economies, of culture, of struggle, of geopolitics, as to individuals, doctrines, and polemics. Abolish, she said. Monique Wittig writes, quote, "When we discover that women are the objects of oppression and appropriation, at the very moment that we become able to perceive this, we become subjects in the sense of cognitive subjects through an operation of abstraction. Consciousness of oppression is not only a reaction to fight against oppression, it is also the whole conceptual reevaluation of the social world, its whole reorganization with new concepts from the point of view of oppression. It is what I would call the science of oppression created by the oppressed. This operation of understanding reality has to be undertaken by every one of us. Call it a subjective, cognitive practice. It is we who historically must undertake the task of defining the individual subject in materialist terms. This certainly seems to be an impossibility, since materialism and subjectivity have always been mutually exclusive. Nevertheless, and rather than despair of ever understanding, we must recognize the need to reach subjectivity and the abandonment by many of us to the myth woman, the myth of woman being only a snare that holds us up. At this point, let us say that a new personal and subjective definition for all humankind can only be found beyond the categories of sex, woman and man, and that the advent of individual subjects demands first destroying the categories of sex, ending the use of them, and rejecting all sciences which still use these categories as their fundamentals, practically all social sciences. For us, this is an absolute necessity. Our survival demands that we contribute all our strength. Apologies, lost my place. To the destruction of the class of women within which men appropriate women. This can be accomplished only by the destruction of heterosexuality as a social system, which is based on the oppression of women by men, and which produces the doctrine of the difference between the sexes to justify this oppression." End of quote. And that's from The Straight Mind and Other Essays, English translation, collection of Wittig's essays. In this long quote I've just presented, we get a number of moves. The rationality of Marxist feminism here is seen as self-abolition, plain and simple. Yet a number of mediations present themselves: class, individuals, sexuality, women, subjects, mediations with a very complicated and obviously often unhelpful historical and political baggage. Wittig indicates the dialectics between individual and class in the movement of self-abolition. One must be attained, then abolished, then the next, to be abolished, etc. All must be moved through, their potential seized, their limits realized. To answer the question of the individual subject in materialist terms, Wittig poses self-abolition as a long process, punctuated by the strategic affirmation of a number of ultimately undesirable identities which are dialectically sloughed off. Each is not all, and thus does not complete a movement, either positively or negatively. I said before that the abolition of women as a process of self-abolition implicitly models women on the proletariat, the same structure of a revolutionary subject. In Wittig, this is not metaphoric, but women are immediately for her a class, a historical class formed in a class relation with men, to serve the dominant social group, that is, men. This finds her occupying a similar part of the materialist feminist spectrum as Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex. Woman is the name of a class relation, hence her famous position that lesbians are not women because they are not subordinated to men, just as you can't have workers without the existence of capitalists. The gender relation is strongly overdetermined by the dominant term, just like the capital relation. This is why the doctrine of difference is seen as only oppressive and not as something to be transvalued or reappropriated as it is for Lonzi and that tendency of feminism. For Wittig, it is too overdetermined by patriarchal history, too descriptive of the woman made by that history. In accordance with this, although much more schematically, at least in this text, we can listen to Maya Gonzalez writing in Communization and the Abolition of Gender, quote, "In the course of struggle, women will therefore come into conflict with men. They will be criticized for derailing the movement, for diverting it from its primary goals. But the goal of the struggle lies elsewhere. It is only from within this and other conflicts that the proletariat will come to see its class belonging as an external constraint, an impasse which it will have to overcome in order to be anything at all beyond its relation to capital. That overcoming is only the revolution as communization, which destroys gender and all the other divisions that come between us." End of quote. The important point here is that unless self-abolition is extended to the overcoming of the gender relation, as it functions to reproduce capital and the relations between men and women, the self-abolition of the proletariat, under whatever conditions it takes place, will never pose an adequate resolution to the situation of women. While here stated as a series of axioms, Gonzalez's point is crucial with regard to the paradox of self-abolition. Those who are constituted by a relation cannot at the same time abolish that relation, also because they are constituted as particular subjects within that process, with very different relations to the idea of overcoming, or to the goal of overcoming. So, for example, the politics and ethics of gender are commonly overlooked by those who claim to want to smash capitalism. Thus, the self-abolition starts in different places, depending on what is to be abolished. As we see in Wittig, certain things must be realized before being abolished, which to my mind is both highly ambiguous, leaving us with an argument nowhere near as clean as Gonzalez's, and suggestive. For Lonzi, however, and here I will stick primarily to her manifesto text, Let's Spit on Hegel, which we hopefully read, the class struggle is a detour, a diversion, both for women and for youth, who are always young men, leading them into patriarchal enclosures in which society is only superficially altered, rather than addressing the primary injustice from which all others derive, that is, the oppression of women. Revolutions and property relations, for example, that do not touch on the woman in the family as the original property that supports patriarchy, are to be considered superficial revolutions. Although this is not to neglect the fact that most of the time these revolutions also do not liberate workers either. Lonzi writes, "The oppression of women will not be overcome by annihilating man, nor will equality cancel it. Oppression will continue with equality. Revolution will not cancel it. It will continue with revolution." End of quote. Like Wittig and Gonzalez, Lonzi understands the need for a wholesale transformation, not for fighting for a larger share of rights within the existing order, though that should go without saying for any radical perspective. Unlike Wittig and Gonzalez as part of the dismantling of the patriarchy in which the man-woman division is integral, women are independent and self-sufficient. It is men and the universal frame in which their interests are expressed and their institutions developed, institutions which are constructed on the hatred and marginalization of women, which are the problem. Also, for her, the historical episodes of revolution are closed and not incomplete or soon defeated by reactionary forces. They just don't include women and never have. Women's alienation from politics is a reflection of this. There is a crucial recognition in her work that power cannot be expanded or transvalued, though again, a practice like entrustment would negotiate this differently a few years later. Cannot be expanded or transvalued to be wielded by different kinds of subjects, its character as power changing in the process. So we can think of the power to versus the power over distinction as an example of that viewpoint. Power is identified with the male principle, and all women have an interest in its dissolution. Women is here figured as a metaphysical principle of revolt, grounded in the mother-son relation. She is another universality, another subjectivity. Crucially, she is the irony of the community in Hegel's terms, alienated from men's equality, men's language, men's laws, the tenets of progress in a civilization which remains constitutively patriarchal. This is a legacy we would do well to process much more closely than we have up until now. This challenge to symbolic universals, such as ethics and justice. The appeal of equality and representation is something which the most radical and antinomian feminism cannot help but take as its point of departure, which is also quite clear from the social media-driven feminist phenomena all around us today. The question of pragmatism, for example, belongs here as well. What transitional or ameliorative measures exceed themselves and can produce radical subjectivities with demands that cannot be contained by such measures. For example, the politics of representation for those subjects who were never figured as part of the social order in the first place. Dramatized in the Lonzi text is the need to establish an autonomy for women's struggles, the need for a politics that can redeem women from their symbolic impoverishment at the hands of the patriarchal gender relation. This can come, perversely I think, to mean an excision from every other collective, every other struggle. In its desire to affirm what always has been rendered as a secondary issue or contradiction, whose resolution would come in train of other social and political shifts, Lonzi instead takes the figure of woman as fundamental. A figure at this level of abstraction, programmatically severed from all other social antagonisms, with the inspiring and incisive radicality of its conception of revolt, can find itself empty enough to contain all kinds of reactionary prescriptions, such as the heteronormative, white, and many other familiar exclusions, that de Loretis, for example. Because the condition of being a woman is seen not as a concrete historical experience, as well as a really abstract structural position that can be negated, the question of the subject of abolition is not posed. The subject is first displaced to the male universal, then reappropriated as feminine futurity. So final notes on abolition. The virtue of the thought of abolition is that it sets its horizon within the imminence of struggle, but there are still limitations to the concept. This chiefly has to do with the break between the determinacy of the analysis and the abstraction of the imperative to abolish, as well as the strict analytic split between structure and history that it presupposes. The subject of abolition emerges through the struggle that abolition entails, yet must also arrive at a point where the militant identity emerging through struggle has to eliminate its basis in the society the movement wants to change or overcome. The politics of subjectivity always interferes with the schema of self-abolition. Who is the subject that initiates and who comes out of the other side of self-abolition? The politics of abolition seem to be unable either to be done with or even to really formulate this paradox of subjectivity. Self-abolition can then seem like a deterministic formula which conflates strategy and ontology. On the other hand, it speaks to the necessity of eradicating the ground on which you stand as part of the transformation you desire. But still it risks an illusory concreteness which is logical and schematic rather than historical and mediated. The problematic here is one of circumscribing categories, but also what it means to keep history and logic, or different levels of abstraction, apart. As Cinzia Arruzza writes in Logic or History, the Political Stakes of Marxist Feminist Theory, we must be careful about tendencies to conflate levels of thought and practice which are related, but non-identical, in the hopes that this will politically ground our theoretical work. She writes, proving the logical necessity of gender oppression for capitalism arises from an understandable political concern, i.e. the worry that failing to demonstrate this logical dependence would mean that gender oppression is politically secondary to class politics. I think that we should reject, rather than to answer, this interpolation, given that it rests on a mistaken presupposition. The dynamics of political struggle cannot be directly deduced from theoretical observations at this level of abstraction. The paradox of abolition, then, is a paradox of abstraction translated into action. It tries to skate over subjectivity, but also temporality, since subjectivity, once achieved, such as the collective subject of women for the first time in history, is hard to jettison. Others here will speak, or have spoken already, of the difficult processes of subjectivation, construction, relationality, and survival over time in instances of feminist community, such as the Milan Women's Bookstore. What I wanted us to think about is how problems of constitution are also problems of separation, but then also of putting into question the basis on which a collective separation has been effected. Many thanks.